In our neighborhood, perfection wasn't just admired. It was enforced with the zealous ferocity of a royal decree. Every lawn manicured, every bush trimmed to an inch of its life. It was a beautiful prison built on the twin foundations of conformity and unspoken judgment, and at the heart of that system, a self-appointed tyrant reigned. Karen, that's the name that fits the particular brand of suburban tyranny she wielded as the HOA President, a title she treated less like a duty and more like a crown. For months, the disputes had been petty, annoying skirmishes. My fence was apparently a shade too dark for the community's color palette. My recycling bin, God forbid, remained visible from the street for a full 3 minutes after the collection truck passed. I ignored her increasingly shrill notes, treating them as the background noise of life in a heavily managed community. I held to a simple, fundamental truth. I paid my dues, I obeyed the law, and my property was my own. But Karen wasn't accustomed to being ignored. She was a woman for whom no was merely the prelude to her ultimate, and often destructive. Yes, her sense of entitlement festered, growing from simple annoyance into a chilling, singular obsession with control over my small piece of the world, specifically, my shed. It was just a shed, a humble structure where I kept my lawnmower, my tools, and the usual necessary detritus of a homeowner. Yet, in Karen's eyes, this shed was an affront to her perfect vision. It was too close to the property line, too distinctly mine, and therefore a challenge to her authority. The notes escalated, moving from citations to veiled threats of fines and legal action, all based on increasingly obscure and impossible to prove architectural guidelines. I started feeling eyes on my property, a constant, low-level hum of surveillance that made pulling into my own driveway feel like crossing a border checkpoint. The shed, once a place of practical storage, became the last, defiant bastion of my privacy. I knew she was escalating, but I never imagined the depth of her malice. After a few suspicious inspections and misplaced gardening tools, I took a precaution. I installed a small, motion-activated security alarm inside the shed, a cheap, loud noisemaker intended mostly to scare off raccoons or bored teenagers, certainly not a community leader. Then came the night. The house was quiet, the world outside, wrapped in the deep, velvet silence of the suburbs after midnight. I was jerked awake by a sound that pierced the darkness like a siren, the high-pitched, insistent wail of that cheap alarm. My blood ran cold, a shocking burst of pure adrenaline. It wasn't the sound of fire or emergency, it was the sound of a breach. I scrambled to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs, and saw it. The shed was bathed in the harsh, strobing light of the alarm's indicator lamp. And there, caught momentarily in the beam, was a figure, a shadowy person, fumbling with the lock, instantly recoiling at the noise, then sprinting awkwardly away from my property and disappearing into the darkness that bordered the property line. I immediately called 911, my voice tight and raw with shock. Who was at my shed? A thief wouldn't trigger the alarm then just walk away. This felt different, this felt personal. When the figure fled, they dropped something, and as the lights continued to flash, I saw a glint of metal near the door, reflecting the pulsing light. The police were on their way, but a terrible, sickening realization was already sinking its teeth into me. The intruder hadn't just been a thief. This was the work of someone with a meticulously planned, deeply rooted grudge. This was the moment. The battle moved from the trivial paperwork of the HOA to the terrifying reality of a criminal act. The alarm had done more than just summon the police. It had sounded the final, violent, and undeniable death knell for any pretense of peace in our neighborhood. Within minutes of my panicked 911 call, the quiet darkness of our suburban street was shattered by the rhythmic flash of blue and red light. Two patrol cars arrived, transforming my yard from a picture of domestic tranquility into a potential crime scene. The officers, professional and methodical, treated the situation with the gravity it deserved, despite the seemingly petty location, a simple garden shed. They started by meticulously examining the evidence, The lock on the shed door was visibly bent and distorted, clearly showing signs of being tampered with, not by a clumsy hand, but by a tool wielded with frustrated malice. This wasn't a case of a lock being easily popped. This was a deliberate, forceful attempt at a legal entry that had only been stopped by the unexpected shriek of my alarm system. They dusted for prints, although the cold night air and the dew-kissed metal made finding anything solid unlikely. More critically, they examined the ground. My lawn, usually pristine, bore the faint but undeniable imprint of fresh footprints. These weren't the heavy, lumbering steps of a typical burglar, but smaller, more deliberate prints that led away from the shed, across the dewy grass, and stopped abruptly at the invisible boundary marking Karen's property line. As the officers shone their powerful flashlights, the atmosphere grew heavy with suspicion. A common thief would never risk leaving such a clear trail, nor would they simply abandon their efforts when the alarm sounded. They would be long gone. This felt different. It felt intimate, violating, and chillingly personal. The officers, though trained to be neutral, shared a knowing look that confirmed my growing dread. The perpetrator was likely someone local, someone with a vendetta, someone who felt entitled to trespass. Then came the definitive clue. Near the rose bushes that separated our properties, a small, bright piece of fabric was caught on a thorny branch. It was a fragment, torn loose in the frantic scramble away from the shed. One of the officers carefully retrieved it. It was a distinctive, almost neon pink material, instantly recognizable to anyone in the neighborhood. It was torn from a vest, the very bright pink gardening vest that Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, wore almost religiously whenever she was patrolling the neighborhood to issue her mandates. My stomach dropped, not from surprise, but from the sickening confirmation of my worst fears. The HOA President, the very woman tasked with upholding the community's standards and safety, had been caught trying to break into my private property. The police proceeded to interview her. Of course, she met them at her door in a state of carefully manufactured outrage, claiming she had been asleep, feigning shock at the audacity of the intruders, disrupting her perfect night. But the official police report, meticulously detailing the bent lock, the directional footprints, and the recovery of the pink fabric, was filed against a known person. The war had escalated from notes on my door to a documented criminal investigation, and the HOA President was firmly positioned on the other side of the police tape. Armed with the official police report, a document detailing the forced entry attempt and the highly suspicious evidence pointing directly to Karen, I formally confronted the HOA board. I expected immediate action, suspension, condemnation, maybe even a public apology. Instead, I was met with the cold, bureaucratic wall of institutional self-preservation. Karen, a master manipulator and seasoned political infighter, had already activated her counteroffensive. She framed the incident not as a crime she committed, but as a malicious slander against her, a desperate attempt by me to discredit her because she had dared to enforce the rules about my shed. The sheer level of deflection was breathtaking. The board, composed largely of people she had either appointed or intimidated into silence, backed her play. They accepted her flimsy alibi and launched an internal investigation not into the break-in, but into my character, subtly shifting the focus onto my unhinged accusations and the perceived disrespect I showed the board. She even had her high-powered attorney send me a cease and desist order, threatening a lawsuit for defamation and hinting at a restraining order against me for harassment. It was a terrifying inversion of justice. The victim of a crime was now being legally persecuted by the criminal. The neighborhood, once a source of mild, manageable irritation, now became a hostile ecosystem. Karen, using her position of power and her skillful deployment of gossip, began to weaponize the community against me. The story she spun was simple and toxic. I was a mentally unstable, vengeful resident who fabricated evidence, including a police report, simply because I didn't want to follow the rules about my shed. Suddenly, the neighbors who used to wave now looked away sharply as I passed, or clustered in hushed, suspicious groups on the sidewalk, casting sharp, judgmental glances toward my house. I was rapidly becoming the neighborhood pariah, the man who dared to challenge the established, even if corrupt, authority. The weight of this isolation was crushing. It was no longer a simple property dispute. It was a psychological and financial war waged by an entire institution, led by a sociopathic bully against a single homeowner. Every conversation felt like a trap. Every silent avoidance felt like a vote against my character. I was fighting the insidious power of organized groupthink, the fear of losing social standing, and the deep, dark pockets of the HOA's legal fund. Yet, with the police report in hand, detailing the truth of the bent lock and the pink fabric, I knew I could not back down. The humiliation and injustice of her breaking in and then having the colossal nerve to sue me over it fueled a grim determination. I was alone, but I was right, and I resolved to fight this entrenched tyranny until the very end, no matter the personal costs. With the police report proving the attempted breach, the fight moved from my front yard into the sterile, unforgiving arena of the courtroom. This was the most terrifying phase, because Karen, through the HOA, had access to essentially unlimited legal funds derived from our collective dues. They hired a high-powered, ruthless firm whose sole purpose seemed to be overwhelming me with paperwork, depositions, and motions, a legal blitzkrieg designed to drain my resolve and, more importantly, my savings. It was a war of attrition, and I was holding onto my lawyer's advice like a lifeline. We don't just fight. We counterattack. We filed a civil suit against Karen, personally, for trespass, property damage, and emotional distress, and against the HOA board for negligence and failure of fiduciary duty in protecting a criminal, a move designed to force them to take responsibility or bankrupt their leader. The sheer volume of legal discovery was overwhelming. Karen, under oath during her deposition, was a magnificent, horrifying liar. She denied everything with cold, clinical certainty. She swore the pink fabric was a coincidence, claimed the footprints belonged to a delivery man, and maintained that she was a dedicated community servant being persecuted by a mentally unstable homeowner who was fabricating evidence to avoid a fine. Her lawyer, a smarmy veteran of HOA battles, sat beside her, radiating smug confidence, watching my bank account dwindle with every passing hour. Every day felt like a defeat, even when we filed a strong motion, because the financial cost of justice felt impossibly high. I was constantly asked to provide more proof, while Karen's story, though transparently false, was consistent and backed by the institutional might of the HOA. I felt the immense psychological strain. The isolation continued. Neighbors, terrified of Karen's future vengeance, refused to offer any supportive statements. It seemed impossible that her influence could penetrate even the walls of the courthouse. I was standing on the precipice of ruin, ready to cave just to make the financial nightmare stop. When the impossible happened, I received an anonymous, frantic call. It was Mr. Henderson, a quiet, older man who lived two doors down, one of the neighbors who had studiously avoided my gaze for months. He confessed his fear of Karen, admitting he had initially believed her narrative about me being unhinged, but then he saw her deposition, where she lied so baldly, so arrogantly, that it sickened him. He revealed that he had installed a motion-activated trail camera pointed towards his own yard to catch a persistent deer problem. Critically, the camera's wide-angle lens and the proximity to the property line had accidentally captured the entire incident at my shed. He was too terrified of the legal repercussions to send it directly, so we arranged a discreet meeting in a public parking garage, an absurd cloak and dagger operation for a suburban property dispute. There, in the dim light of a concrete pillar, he handed me a simple USB drive. My hands were shaking as I drove home. I plugged the drive into my computer, my heart pounding a violent rhythm against my ribs. And there it was, not a grainy, indistinct silhouette, but a clear, time-stamped video showing Karen, in her notorious bright pink vest, approaching my shed, trying to pick the lock with a tool, and then recoiling in shock when the alarm exploded into life. It was undeniable. It was incontrovertible. It was the undeniable, absolute, irrefutable truth I had fought for months to prove. All the lies, the slander, The legal abuse, it all evaporated in the silent, flashing proof of that tiny video file. My exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, burning feeling of absolute vindication. The game was over. I finally had her. The shift in our legal strategy was immediate and aggressive. The trail camera footage was the nuclear option, the smoking gun that rendered every single one of Karen's previous statements perjurious. We didn't simply hand the footage over. We held it back, planning its revelation for the most dramatic and devastating moment, Karen's appearance on the witness stand at the civil trial. We needed her arrogance to be her final undoing. The day of the trial arrived, the air in the sterile courtroom thick with tension. Karen, radiating a false, brutal composure, took the stand. She was coached well, maintaining her narrative of the dedicated community volunteer being persecuted by a reckless neighbor. She spoke about her integrity, her dedication, and the injustice of the accusations. Her lawyer sat back, satisfied, believing they had established reasonable doubt after all. They had successfully smeared my reputation for months, and without solid proof, it was my word against the HOA's institution. Then, the cross-examination began. My attorney, calm and surgical, first methodically dismantled every petty detail of her prior testimony, the timing of her alleged sleeplessness, the location of her shoes, the flimsy nature of her alibi. He led her down a path of increasing self-assurance, letting her reiterate, under oath, that she had never been near my shed and that any accusation otherwise was a malicious fabrication. He asked the question one final time, his voice slow and deliberate. Miss Smith, I need you to confirm for the court, beyond any doubt, were you, at any point, on the property of the plaintiff on the night of the incident? Karen looked directly at the judge, gave a dismissive laugh, and stated, absolutely not. I was asleep. That was the moment. My lawyer didn't react. He simply turned to the court technician and, with a curt nod, commanded, present Exhibit Delta. The lights dimmed, and the low hum of the projector filled the room. The grainy, but perfectly clear, time-stamped footage from the trail camera filled the large screen. It showed Karen, illuminated by the flashing red light of my alarm, trying to force the lock. It showed her flinching, her expression caught in a brief flash of sheer panic before she fled the scene. The courtroom fell into a stunned, absolute silence. You could hear the faint whir of the projector fan over the crushing sound of Karen's plea collapsing. I didn't look at the screen. I looked at Karen's face. Her carefully constructed composure fractured instantly. Her eyes darted from the screen to her lawyer, who had gone utterly pale, then back to the judge. Her face twisted through denial, then disbelief, and finally, into a look of absolute, soul-deep humiliation. It was the face of a tyrant, stripped of all power and utterly exposed. The judge, a formidable man known for his stern reserve, didn't even call or assess. He simply stared down at Karen over the bench with an expression that was more than judicial. It was one of profound, utter disapproval. He found Karen personally liable on every single count: trespass, willful property damage, and the egregious act of using her official position to commit a crime and then persecute the victim. He awarded me substantial damages, enough to cover all my legal fees and compensate for the months of emotional distress. And, most importantly, he issued an order compelling the HOA board to immediately initiate formal recall proceedings, citing her egregious breach of fiduciary trust. Karen was done. She left the courtroom not as the powerful HOA president, but as a disgraced, defeated woman, forever documented as a trespasser and a liar. The final, sweet victory was ours, a victory for every homeowner who had ever suffered under the petty tyranny of an unchecked HOA. The judge's ruling was more than just a legal victory. It was a detonation that finally blew open the walls of fear and complicity surrounding the HOA, the verdict that found Karen personally liable for trespass and ordered her removal from the board sent immediate shockwaves through the entire community. It was the absolute, undeniable proof that the woman who had terrorized us all was, in fact, a common criminal and a brazen liar. The local media picked up the story almost instantly. HOA President caught breaking in on video, and the floodgates of public outrage opened wide. The silence that had protected Karen for so long was replaced by a deafening chorus of indignation. Emails flooded the HOA management company and the remaining board members, not with suggestions, but with demands for immediate accountability, transparency, and wholesale change. Neighbors who had ducked their heads and crossed the street to avoid me now reached out, awkwardly at first, then with genuine remorse. They had believed her, they admitted, or at least they had been too afraid of her retribution to speak the truth. They apologized for their silence, realizing that their inaction had empowered her tyranny. The immediate fallout was total chaos for the old guard. The board members, who had enabled Karen and tried to discredit the police report, found themselves facing a massive, unified recall movement. They didn't even wait for the formal vote. One by one, they resigned in disgrace, unwilling to face the fury of their suddenly awakened constituents. It was a cleansing fire, long overdue. The community had suffered under a repressive regime, and now, finally, the victims had banded together to overthrow the oppressor. A new HOA meeting was called, but this one was different. It wasn't a stilted, stage-managed affair. The room was packed, charged with passionate, honest energy. Residents who had never spoken before stood up and shared their own stories of Karen's bullying, her arbitrary fines, her misuse of community funds. The central motion was simple: the immediate and permanent removal of Karen as president, a measure that passed with a near-unanimous show of raised hands. It was a beautiful, cathartic moment, the sight of all those hands, finally raised in unity, casting off the shadow of her control. Karen, utterly disgraced, vanished from public life. Her last act was to try and sell her house discreetly, a pathetic attempt at a quiet escape. But the entire neighborhood knew the truth. Within weeks, the telltale sign of final defeat, a for sale sign, was hammered into her immaculate lawn. When she finally moved, it wasn't a tearful farewell. It was a quiet, unnoticed retreat of a defeated tyrant. She left behind only the memory of her toxic influence and a community forced to rebuild itself from the ashes of her reign. The victory wasn't just mine. It was a profound victory for the fundamental principle that no one, especially not those in positions of local power, is above the law or the moral obligation to treat their neighbors with decency. With Karen gone and the old board dissolved, the community began the long, quiet process of healing. A new, genuinely representative HOA board was elected, a group of diverse, level-headed neighbors committed to transparency and open dialogue, not personal fiefdoms. They scrapped the old, arbitrary rules, instituted clear financial audits, and prioritized actual community welfare over petty aesthetic control. It was a monumental shift, a testament to the power of a single fight to spark total institutional reform. For me, life slowly settled into a new normal. The legal pressure was gone, the constant surveillance had ceased, and the shame and isolation inflicted by Karen's gossip had been replaced by genuine, heartfelt apologies from neighbors. The house felt peaceful again, truly my sanctuary, my shed. The simple structure that had become the epicenter of an ugly war was now just a shed again, albeit one fitted with a new, reinforced steel lock and to very visible, high-definition security cameras. It serves as a quiet reminder that peace must always be actively guarded. The cost of this war was immense, not just financially, but emotionally. I lost months of sleep, endured crippling stress, and faced the painful breakdown of community relations. But what I gained was far more valuable, an unshakable belief in the principle of standing firm against a bully, regardless of their power. I learned that the sanctity of private property and the security of one's home are fundamental rights that must be fiercely protected from those who believe they are entitled to violate them in the name of community standards. The final closure, beyond the verdict, came in a sterile envelope delivered to my door. Inside was a cashier's check for the full amount of the damages and legal fees, a direct transfer from Karen's personal assets. It was a cold, satisfying piece of paper that confirmed her humiliation and ended the financial nightmare. It wasn't about the money, it was the final, irrefutable acknowledgement of the truth. Her financial ruin was the final balance struck for the misery she had caused. My experience became a strange form of local legend, a cautionary tale for neighbors about the dangers of unchecked HOA power, and an inspiration for those facing similar petty tyrannies. I often sit on my porch now, looking out at the street. It's quiet, peaceful, and the neighbors wave, genuinely. The victory wasn't loud or explosive. It was the quiet, profound realization that I had faced down the forces of entitlement and corruption, and I had won. The alarm in my shed had done more than summon the police. It had triggered a revolution in my street, restoring a sense of justice and reminding us all that sometimes the biggest battles are fought over the smallest, most personal spaces. I am no longer just a homeowner. I am a survivor, a defender of boundaries, and a keeper of the hard-won peace.